The alarm that woke Commander Helen Price at 5 in the morning was not the gentle chime of her regular wake-up call. It was the sharp, urgent blare of a station-wide emergency. She was out of bed and into her uniform in under 2 minutes, her heart pounding as she ran toward the command center. The corridors were already filled with crew members rushing to their stations, confusion and worry written across every face. Dr. Peter Hayes met her at the entrance to the command center, and the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. The hatchlings were gone. Not sleeping in a corner, not hiding behind the exotic plants, but completely and utterly gone. Helen felt her stomach drop as the full weight of the situation crashed down on her. The habitat was sealed. That was the first thing Hayes explained in a rush. The environmental systems showed no breaches. The doors had not been opened since the last check at midnight. Yet somehow, 3 dragon hatchlings had vanished from a locked room in the middle of a space station. It should have been impossible, but the empty habitat proved otherwise. Helen immediately called for Security Officer Greg Palmer. He was already pulling up camera footage, his fingers flying across his console as he searched for any clue. The team gathered around his screens, watching hours of recordings at high speed. For a long time, they saw nothing unusual. The hatchlings moved around their habitat, ate, rested, and explored. Then at approximately 2 in the morning, something changed. One of the hatchlings, the smallest one, approached a ventilation grate near the floor. It sniffed at the edges, then did something that made everyone watching lean forward in disbelief. The hatchling seemed to compress itself, its body becoming impossibly thin and flexible. It squeezed through the gaps in the grate, gaps that should have been far too small for anything larger than a rat. Within minutes, the other 2 hatchlings followed. They moved through the ventilation system like liquid, their bodies adapting to spaces that should have crushed them. The last camera to catch them showed all 3 entering the main air circulation system, and after that, they simply disappeared into the maze of ducts and tunnels that ran through the entire station. Helen declared a Code 3 emergency, the highest alert short of actual danger to the station. Every available crew member was pulled from their regular duties and assigned to search teams. The station had over 200 kilometers of corridors, maintenance tunnels, cargo bays, and service areas. Finding 3 small creatures in that much space would be like finding needles in a haystack, but they had no choice. They had to try. Ambassador Lisa Chen sent an urgent message to the Dragon representatives. Her hands shook as she composed it, trying to find words that would explain the inexplicable. How did you tell an ancient and powerful species that you had lost their children within 72 hours of receiving them? The response came quickly, and it was not reassuring. The dragons wanted updates every 6 hours. They wanted to know everything that was being done to find the hatchlings. The unspoken threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Dr. Hayes led a team of xenobiologists through the station, carrying sensors calibrated to detect dragon biosigns. They started with the areas closest to the habitat and worked outward in expanding circles. Hours passed with no results. The sensors picked up nothing. It was as if the hatchlings had simply ceased to exist. Greg Palmer coordinated the physical search teams. Groups of 4 crew members were assigned to specific sections, checking every storage closet, every maintenance access point, every possible hiding place. They called out softly as they searched, trying to sound friendly and non-threatening. The hatchlings had learned some basic human language during their preparation for the visit. Surely they would respond if they heard kind voices, but there was no response. Day 1 of the search ended with nothing to show for it. Helen stood in the command center, staring at the 3-dimensional map of the station covered in green zones marking searched areas. So much ground covered and yet no sign of the hatchlings. She sent her update to the dragons and tried to sleep, though rest came in brief, troubled fragments. Day 2 brought more of the same. Search teams grew tired and frustrated. The initial adrenaline of the emergency had worn off, replaced by a grinding determination. Dr. Hayes proposed that the hatchlings might be frightened, that the artificial environment had stressed them more than anyone realized. Perhaps they were hiding, scared and alone in the dark spaces of the station. He suggested leaving food in strategic locations, hoping to lure them out. Small feeding stations were set up in maintenance areas throughout the station. Each one was monitored by a camera. The food was checked every few hours. Some of it disappeared, but the cameras never showed what took it. The footage would be clear one moment, and the next, food would be gone. It was as if the hatchlings had learned to avoid the cameras, or worse, had figured out how to move too quickly for human technology to track. A week passed, then 2 weeks. The search continued, but hope began to fade. Crew members whispered in the halls, wondering what would happen if the hatchlings were never found. Would the dragons blame them? Would there be consequences? The adults had seemed peaceful, but everyone knew that dragons were capable of terrible things when angered. Ambassador Chen looked older with each passing day. She spent hours in communication with the dragon representatives, providing updates that always contained the same disappointing message. Still searching. No results yet. The dragon's responses grew shorter and colder. Their patience was clearly running thin. Helen refused to give up. She personally joined search teams, crawling through maintenance tunnels and inspecting cargo holds. If the hatchlings were somewhere on her station, she would find them. She had to. The alternative was too terrible to consider. By the end of the 3rd week, the station had been searched from bow to stern 3 times over. Every possible hiding place had been checked and rechecked. The feeding stations continued to lose food, but the hatchlings remained invisible. Dr. Hayes admitted in a private meeting that he was starting to fear the worst. Perhaps the hatchlings had found a way off the station. Perhaps they had been injured and were hiding because they were hurt. Perhaps they had died, and their bodies were somewhere no one had thought to look. Helen refused to accept that. The station's sensors would have detected decomposition. The hatchlings had to be alive and somewhere nearby. But where? And why wouldn't they show themselves? The questions haunted her as she walked the corridors, searching for answers that refused to come. Meanwhile, in the lower decks of the station, in a place where few people ever ventured, the real answer was living and breathing, completely unknown to those who searched so desperately. Engineering Bay 12 was located in the lower sections of Station Liberty, far from the elegant habitat rings and busy commercial districts that most crew members frequented. It was a place of function over form, where pipes ran exposed along the walls and the air always smelled faintly of machine oil and ozone. For Chief Mechanic Danny Ward, it was home in a way his assigned quarters had never been. Danny had been working on Station Liberty for 3 years now, and in that time he had made Engineering Bay 12 entirely his own. The space was cluttered with tools, spare parts, and half-finished projects that only he understood. His workbench was scarred from years of use, covered with the kind of organized chaos that would drive a neat person crazy, but made perfect sense to him. He had an old couch pushed against one wall, its cushions worn flat from the times he had crashed there after long shifts. A coffee maker that he had repaired 4 times sat on a shelf, perpetually brewing something that was technically coffee but tasted like battery acid. He was 28 years old, originally from the Detroit reclamation zone on Earth, where he had grown up in the shadow of old factories being slowly brought back to life. His father had been a maintenance worker for the terraforming equipment, and Danny had learned to fix things before he learned to read properly. Give him a broken machine and a handful of tools, and he could work miracles. Give him a formal dinner party or a diplomatic reception, and he would be lost within minutes. The search for the missing dragon hatchlings had turned the station upside down. But down in Engineering Bay 12, life went on much as it always had. Danny was aware of the crisis, of course. Everyone was aware of it. But his job did not stop just because important aliens were missing. If anything, his workload had increased dramatically. With so many crew members pulled into search duties, regular maintenance was falling behind. Systems that should have been checked weekly were going 2 or 3 weeks without attention. Danny found himself working double and sometimes triple shifts, moving from one repair to another with barely enough time to grab food and coffee in between. He did not complain. Complaining never fixed anything. The station's environmental systems needed constant adjustment. The reactor cooling loops required monitoring. The gravity generators had developed a worrying vibration that Danny was trying to track down before it became a serious problem. Every day brought a new list of tasks, and every night he fell into bed exhausted, only to wake up and start again. It was during the 2nd week of the crisis that Danny started noticing odd things in his workspace. Small things that he might have imagined if he had been less observant. He would leave a sandwich on his workbench while he went to check a gauge or fetch a tool, and when he came back, half of it would be gone. Not moldy or dried out, but cleanly eaten as if something had taken precise bites. His tools started moving around. He was meticulous about tool placement, Each wrench and screwdriver returned to its proper spot on the pegboard above his bench, but he would reach for a specific tool and find it missing, only to discover it on the other side of the workshop, sometimes in places he was certain he had never left it. The sounds were harder to dismiss. Late at night, when the station was quiet and most systems had cycled down to standby mode, he would hear soft chirping noises. They were not mechanical sounds, not the hum of electricity or the hiss of air through ducts. They were organic, almost musical, coming from different parts of the bay at different times. Danny was practical to his core. He did not believe in ghosts or space phenomena. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the ventilation system was making weird noises. Maybe he was more tired than he thought and forgetting where he put his tools. Maybe some small animal had gotten loose from the biology labs and was living in his workspace. He made a mental note to set up a camera to figure out what was happening. But between his crushing workload and his exhaustion, he never got around to it. He started talking to himself more, a habit he had developed years ago when working alone. It helped him think through problems, walking through the steps of a repair out loud. He did not realize that something was listening, learning the patterns of his voice and the rhythm of his days. Engineering Bay 12 was warm from all the machinery, and the constant hum of equipment created a kind of white noise that Danny found soothing. Other people complained about the noise levels in the lower decks, but to Danny it was like music. Every hum and vibration told him something about the health of the systems he maintained. He could tell when something was running smoothly and when it was starting to develop problems just by the sound. His routine was simple and unchanging. He would arrive in the morning with his thermos of terrible coffee, check the overnight logs, and start working through his task list. He ate lunch at his workbench, usually something simple he could eat with one hand while reviewing schematics with the other. He took breaks only when absolutely necessary, and he stayed until the work was done regardless of what the clock said. The other crew members rarely came down to Engineering Bay 12. The upper engineering sections handled most of the routine work, and Danny's bay was reserved for the difficult jobs, the ones that required patience and skill rather than just following a manual. He liked it that way. The solitude let him focus, and he did not have to make small talk or pretend to care about station gossip. As the search for the hatchlings stretched into the third week, Danny's workload became almost unbearable. He was running on coffee and stubbornness, his eyes red from lack of sleep and his hands constantly stained with grease and hydraulic fluid. The station was starting to show signs of neglect, minor problems that would become major ones if not addressed soon. He stopped going back to his quarters entirely. It was too far to walk when he was this tired, and he needed every minute of rest he could get. The couch in Engineering Bay 12 became his bed. It was not comfortable, but it was convenient. He could collapse after his shift, sleep a few hours, and be ready to start again without wasting time on the long walk through the station. What Danny did not know was that he was not alone in his workspace. 3 pairs of eyes watched him every day, learning his patterns and habits. 3 small bodies moved through the walls and ceiling spaces, coming out only when they were certain he would not see them. They ate his forgotten sandwiches, played with his tools when he was not looking, and listened to his voice as he talked his way through repairs. The hatchlings had found something in Engineering Bay 12 that the perfect habitat had never provided. They had found life, real and unguarded, lived by someone who did not know they were there and therefore did not perform or pretend. And slowly, carefully, they were making a decision that would change everything. The reactor housing leak happened at the worst possible time, though Danny supposed there was never a good time for a coolant leak. The alert came through at 6 in the evening on what was already his 14th consecutive day of 18-hour shifts. His body ached in places he had forgotten he had, and the coffee he had been living on had stopped providing energy hours ago. Now it just kept him awake without actually making him functional. But a coolant leak was not something that could wait until tomorrow. If the reactor overheated, the station would have much bigger problems than missing dragon hatchlings. Danny grabbed his emergency repair kit and headed down to the reactor level, his feet moving on autopilot while his mind tried to focus through the fog of exhaustion. The leak was in a junction point where 3 different cooling lines met, a spot that was almost impossible to reach and even harder to repair. Danny had to squeeze into a maintenance crawl space barely wide enough for his shoulders, work with tools extended at arm's length, and do precise welding while lying on his back. It was the kind of job that would have been difficult when he was well rested and alert. In his current state, it was nearly impossible. He worked slowly, carefully, knowing that one mistake could make everything worse. His hands shook from fatigue, and twice he had to stop and rest because his vision started to blur. The temperature in the crawl space was brutally hot, and sweat ran down his face and into his eyes. The welding torch felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest. It took him 6 hours to complete the repair properly. 6 hours of cramped, uncomfortable, dangerous work that left him covered in coolant residue and so tired that he could barely think straight. When he finally crawled out of the maintenance space, he checked the time on his communicator and was surprised to see that it was already past 2 in the morning. His quarters were 4 decks up and what felt like a mile away through the station's corridors. Danny looked down at himself. He was covered in grease, coolant, and sweat. His uniform was filthy. His hands were trembling from exhaustion and the adrenaline crash that always followed high-stakes repairs. The idea of walking all the way to his quarters, showering, and then trying to sleep for the few hours before his shift started again seemed impossible. Engineering Bay 12 was only 2 decks down and much closer. The couch there was not comfortable, but it was serviceable. He had slept there before. He would sleep there again. Danny made the decision without really thinking about it, his body already moving in that direction before his conscious mind caught up. The bay was dark when he arrived, lit only by the standby indicators on various pieces of equipment. The familiar hum of machinery was like a lullaby to his exhausted brain. He did not bother turning on the main lights. He knew this space so well he could navigate it blind. He stumbled to the couch, not even bothering to take off his boots, and collapsed onto the worn cushions. The couch smelled like machine oil and old coffee, scents that other people would probably find unpleasant, but that Danny associated with work and purpose. He was asleep within seconds, his body finally getting the rest it had been desperately demanding for days. He did not feel the first small weight settle onto his chest. His exhaustion was too deep, his sleep too complete. If some part of his brain registered the warmth, it was dismissed as a dream, or the normal heat of the machinery around him. A second weight joined the first, curling against his side. Then a third, nestling into the space between his arm and his ribs. The 3 hatchlings had been waiting for this moment, watching and hoping. For 3 weeks they had observed this human, learning his patterns and his nature. They had seen his dedication to his work, his patience with broken things, and the gentle way he treated even inanimate objects that frustrated him. The smallest hatchling, who would later be called Sparks, pressed its head against Danny's chest and listened to his heartbeat. The rhythm was steady and strong, a comforting sound that resonated with something deep in the hatchling's instincts. This was what they had been searching for. Not luxury or perfection, but life and presence and the simple reality of existence. The middle hatchling, later named Bolt, wrapped its tail around Danny's wrist like a bracelet. The contact was careful, gentle, designed not to wake the sleeping human. The hatchling could feel the pulse in Danny's wrist, another steady rhythm that spoke of life and health. The largest hatchling, who would become Flicker, settled into the curve of Danny's arm and let out a soft, contented chirp that was barely louder than a whisper. For the first time since arriving on the station, all 3 hatchlings felt safe. They felt home. Danny slept through all of it. His exhaustion was so profound that nothing short of an emergency alarm would have woken him. He dreamed vaguely of machinery and repairs, the kind of dreams that came when your work consumed your life. In his dreams, things that were broken became whole again. Problems solved themselves. Everything worked the way it was supposed to work. The warmth on his chest and sides registered in his sleeping mind as pleasant but not unusual. Some part of him, deep in the subconscious realm where dreams and reality blurred together, accepted the presence of the hatchlings as natural. They belonged there. It felt right in a way that did not require explanation or analysis. The hatchlings did not sleep immediately. They stayed awake, watching the human who had unknowingly become their chosen guardian. They studied his face, relaxed now in sleep, free of the lines of stress and fatigue that marked it during his waking hours. They listened to his breathing, deep and steady. They felt the rise and fall of his chest beneath them. In dragon culture, this moment was sacred. The choosing of a guardian was not taken lightly. It was an instinct coded into their very DNA, a process that had evolved over millions of years. The hatchlings knew, in a way that transcended language or conscious thought, that they had found what they needed. This human, this Danny Ward who talked to machines and worked until he dropped from exhaustion, was worthy of their trust. As the hours passed and the station's night cycle deepened, the hatchlings finally allowed themselves to sleep, their breathing synchronized with Danny's. 3 small bodies rising and falling in rhythm with the larger one they rested upon. Their scales, which had been tense and dull during their time in the artificial habitat, began to shimmer again with their natural iridescence. In the command center several decks above, Commander Helen Price was still awake, reviewing search reports and trying to figure out where else to look for the missing hatchlings. She had no idea that her answer was sleeping peacefully on a mechanic's couch in Engineering Bay 12. Dr. Peter Hayes was in his lab, analyzing data and wondering if the hatchlings could have somehow gotten off the station. The possibility haunted him, the idea that they had failed so completely that the dragons had simply vanished into space. Ambassador Lisa Chen was composing another message to the dragon representatives, trying to find words that would maintain hope without making promises she could not keep. The weight of impending disaster pressed down on her shoulders, and through it all, in the warm darkness of a cluttered workshop, a tired mechanic and 3 dragon hatchlings slept together in perfect peace, unaware that their rest would soon be interrupted in a way that would change the course of galactic history. Commander Helen Price had not given up even after 3 weeks of fruitless searching. She refused to accept that the hatchlings were simply gone, that they had vanished without a trace from her station. On this particular morning, she decided to personally lead another sweep of the lower engineering sections. These areas had been searched before, but she wanted to check them again with fresh eyes. Lieutenant Karen White accompanied her along with a small team of security personnel. They started at the bottom levels and worked their way up, checking every bay, every storage room, every maintenance closet. Most of the spaces were locked, used only by specific crew members who had been assigned to work there. They checked them anyway, overriding access codes when necessary. Engineering Bay 12 was on their list, marked as the workspace of Chief Mechanic Danny Ward. Helen knew Danny by reputation, if not personally. He was one of those essential crew members who kept the station running smoothly, the kind of person who did crucial work without ever seeking recognition for it. His bay was usually locked according to the records, but when Lieutenant White tried the door, it slid open without resistance. The bay was dark except for the glow of standby lights on various equipment. It was cluttered in the way of a workspace that belonged to someone who actually used it. Tools arranged in patterns that made sense only to their owner, parts and components organized by some personal logic. The air smelled like machine oil and old coffee. Lieutenant White was about to call out when she saw movement on the couch against the far wall. She raised her hand, signaling the others to stop and stay quiet. Slowly, carefully, she activated her wrist light and aimed it toward the couch. What the light revealed made her breath catch in her throat. Danny Ward was asleep on the couch, still in his work uniform, which was stained with grease and what looked like coolant. That alone was not particularly unusual. What made Lieutenant White freeze and immediately signal Commander Price was what was sleeping with him. 3 dragon hatchlings were curled up on and around Danny's sleeping form. The smallest one was nestled directly on his chest, its head resting over his heart. Another was tucked against his side, its tail wrapped loosely around his wrist. The third was curled in the space between his arm and his body. All 3 were sleeping peacefully, their scales shimmering softly in the dim light. Their breathing was synchronized with Danny's, rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Commander Price moved forward slowly, hardly daring to breathe. She could not believe what she was seeing. For 3 weeks they had searched every corner of the station, and here were the hatchlings sleeping peacefully on a mechanic in a cluttered workshop. She raised her communicator and sent a priority message to Dr. Hayes and Greg Palmer. They needed to see this, but they needed to be careful not to startle anyone. Human or dragon, within 10 minutes, a small group had gathered outside Engineering Bay 12. Dr. Hayes arrived with his scanning equipment, moving with exaggerated care. Greg Palmer brought portable cameras to document everything. Ambassador Chen appeared, still in her sleeping clothes with a jacket thrown over them, her eyes wide with disbelief. They moved into the bay as quietly as possible, spreading out to get different angles of view. Dr. Hayes immediately started taking bio readings from a distance, not wanting to get close enough to disturb the sleeping figures. The data flowing across his screen made him shake his head in wonder. The hatchlings were healthy, perhaps healthier than they had been in the prepared habitat. Their vital signs were strong and steady. Greg Palmer accessed the security footage from Engineering Bay 12, quickly reviewing the last 3 weeks of recordings. What he found was extraordinary. The hatchlings had been living in this space almost from the moment they disappeared. The footage showed them emerging from the walls and ceiling when Danny was working, watching him from hidden vantage points. They never approached him directly while he was awake, but they were always present, always observing. The recordings showed them eating food that Danny left unattended. They played with his tools when he stepped away, handling them with surprising care. They listened when he talked to himself while working, their heads tilting at the sound of his voice. Over the course of 3 weeks, they had learned his patterns, his habits, and his nature. Last night's footage showed Danny arriving after what must have been a brutal shift, barely able to stay on his feet. It showed him collapsing on the couch and falling asleep immediately. Then, after a few minutes, it showed the hatchlings emerging from their hiding spots and approaching the sleeping human. They moved carefully, testing, making sure he would not wake. And then, one by one, they settled onto him and fell asleep themselves. Dr. Hayes watched the footage with tears in his eyes. He had spent weeks building the perfect habitat, convinced that perfection was what the hatchlings needed. But they had abandoned that perfection within days, seeking something else entirely. They had sought out this cluttered, noisy workshop and this exhausted mechanic who barely knew they existed. The implications were staggering. Ambassador Chen stood with her hand over her mouth, trying to process what she was seeing. The diplomatic crisis that had consumed her for weeks suddenly looked very different. The hatchlings had not been lost or frightened or in danger. They had been choosing, and they had chosen a human who had no idea how significant he was about to become. The question now was how to handle this situation. Danny was still sleeping, exhausted beyond the point where normal sounds would wake him. The hatchlings were also deeply asleep, their scales rising and falling with their breathing. Waking them suddenly could be dangerous, could startle the hatchlings and undo whatever fragile bond had formed. Commander Price made a decision. They would secure the area but not disturb anyone yet. Let Danny and the hatchlings wake naturally. In the meantime, they would review every second of footage trying to understand what had happened here. They would prepare for the diplomatic implications of this discovery, and they would figure out how to explain to a mechanic that he had somehow become the most important human in the galaxy. Dr. Hayes continued taking readings and making notes, his scientific mind racing with questions. What had drawn the hatchlings to this specific human? Was it something about Danny personally? Or would any human living naturally have attracted them? What did this reveal about dragon psychology and bonding behavior? The data he was collecting would keep xenobiologists busy for years. As the station's morning cycle began, and the lights automatically brightened in other sections, Engineering Bay 12 remained dim and quiet. The small group of observers maintained their vigil, watching and waiting. This moment felt sacred somehow, important beyond just the diplomatic crisis it would resolve. On the couch, Danny slept on, unaware that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The 3 hatchlings slept with him, safe and content, having found what they had been searching for all along. Not luxury or perfection, but authenticity and presence and the simple comfort of being near someone who lived without pretense. The discovery would answer many questions, but it would raise even more. Why had the hatchlings chosen Danny? What did it mean for human-dragon relations? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen when everyone finally woke up and had to face the reality of what had occurred in this cluttered workshop in the lower decks of Station Liberty? Commander Helen Price had not given up, even after 3 weeks of fruitless searching. She refused to accept that the hatchlings were simply gone, that they had vanished without a trace from her station. On this particular morning, she decided to personally lead another sweep of the lower engineering sections. These areas had been searched before, but she wanted to check them again with fresh eyes. Lieutenant Karen White accompanied her along with a small team of security personnel. They started at the bottom levels and worked their way up, checking every bay, every storage room, every maintenance closet. Most of the spaces were locked, used only by specific crew members who had been assigned to work there. They checked them anyway, overriding access codes when necessary. Engineering Bay 12 was on their list. marked as the workspace of Chief Mechanic Danny Ward. Helen knew Danny by reputation, if not personally. He was one of those essential crew members who kept the station running smoothly, the kind of person who did crucial work without ever seeking recognition for it. His bay was usually locked according to the records, but when Lieutenant White tried the door, it slid open without resistance. The bay was dark except for the glow of standby lights on various equipment. It was cluttered in the way of a workspace that belonged to someone who actually used it. Tools arranged in patterns that made sense only to their owner. Parts and components organized by some personal logic. The air smelled like machine oil and old coffee. Lieutenant White was about to call out when she saw movement on the couch against the far wall. She raised her hand, signaling the others to stop and stay quiet. Slowly, carefully, she activated her wrist light and aimed it toward the couch. What the light revealed made her breath catch in her throat. Danny Ward was asleep on the couch, still in his work uniform, which was stained with grease and what looked like coolant. That alone was not particularly unusual. What made Lieutenant White freeze and immediately signal Commander Price was what was sleeping with him. 3 dragon hatchlings were curled up on and around Danny's sleeping form. The smallest one was nestled directly on his chest, its head resting over his heart. Another was tucked against his side, its tail wrapped loosely around his wrist. The third was curled in the space between his arm and his body. All 3 were sleeping peacefully, their scales shimmering softly in the dim light. Their breathing was synchronized with Danny's, rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Commander Price moved forward slowly, hardly daring to breathe. She could not believe what she was seeing. For 3 weeks they had searched every corner of the station, and here were the hatchlings, sleeping peacefully on a mechanic in a cluttered workshop. She raised her communicator and sent a priority message to Dr. Hayes and Greg Palmer. They needed to see this, but they needed to be careful not to startle anyone, human or dragon. Within 10 minutes, a small group had gathered outside Engineering Bay 12. Dr. Hayes arrived with his scanning equipment, moving with exaggerated care. Greg Palmer brought portable cameras to document everything. Ambassador Chen appeared, still in her sleeping clothes with a jacket thrown over them, her eyes wide with disbelief. They moved into the bay as quietly as possible, spreading out to get different angles of view. Dr. Hayes immediately started taking bio readings from a distance, not wanting to get close enough to disturb the sleeping figures. The data flowing across his screen made him shake his head in wonder. The hatchlings were healthy, perhaps healthier than they had been in the prepared habitat. Their vital signs were strong and steady. Greg Palmer accessed the security footage from Engineering Bay 12, quickly reviewing the last 3 weeks of recordings. What he found was extraordinary. The hatchlings had been living in this space almost from the moment they disappeared. The footage showed them emerging from the walls and ceiling when Danny was working, watching him from hidden vantage points. They never approached him directly while he was awake, but they were always present, always observing. The recordings showed them eating food that Danny left unattended. They played with his tools when he stepped away, handling them with surprising care. They listened when he talked to himself while working, their heads tilting at the sound of his voice. Over the course of 3 weeks, they had learned his patterns, his habits, and his nature. Last night's footage showed Danny arriving after what must have been a brutal shift, barely able to stay on his feet. It showed him collapsing on the couch and falling asleep immediately. Then, after a few minutes, it showed the hatchlings emerging from their hiding spots and approaching the sleeping human. They moved carefully, testing, making sure he would not wake. And then one by one they settled onto him and fell asleep themselves. Dr. Hayes watched the footage with tears in his eyes. He had spent weeks building the perfect habitat, convinced that perfection was what the hatchlings needed. But they had abandoned that perfection within days, seeking something else entirely. They had sought out this cluttered, noisy workshop, and this exhausted mechanic who barely knew they existed. The implications were staggering. Ambassador Chen stood with her hand over her mouth trying to process what she was seeing. The diplomatic crisis that had consumed her for weeks suddenly looked very different. The hatchlings had not been lost or frightened or in danger. They had been choosing, and they had chosen a human who had no idea how significant he was about to become. The question now was how to handle the situation. Danny was still sleeping, exhausted beyond the point where normal sounds would wake him. The hatchlings were also deeply asleep, their scales rising and falling with their breathing. Waking them suddenly could be dangerous, could startle the hatchlings and undo whatever fragile bond had formed. Commander Price made a decision. They would secure the area but not disturb anyone yet. Let Danny and the hatchlings wake naturally. In the meantime, they would review every second of footage, trying to understand what had happened here. They would prepare for the diplomatic implications of this discovery. And they would figure out how to explain to a mechanic that he had somehow become the most important human in the galaxy. Dr. Hayes continued taking readings and making notes, his scientific mind racing with questions. What had drawn the hatchlings to this specific human? Was it something about Danny personally, or would any human living naturally have attracted them? What did this reveal about dragon psychology and bonding behavior? The data he was collecting would keep xenobiologists busy for years. As the station's morning cycle began and the lights automatically brightened in other sections, Engineering Bay 12 remained dim and quiet. The small group of observers maintained their vigil, watching and waiting. This moment felt sacred, somehow important beyond just the diplomatic crisis it would resolve. On the couch, Danny slept on, unaware that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The three hatchlings slept with him, safe and content, having found what they had been searching for all along. Not luxury or perfection, but authenticity and presence and the simple comfort of being near someone who lived without pretense. The discovery would answer many questions, but it would raise even more. Why had the hatchlings chosen Danny? What did it mean for human-dragon relations? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen when everyone finally woke up and had to face the reality of what had occurred in this cluttered workshop in the lower decks of Station Liberty? Dr. Peter Hayes sat in the station's main conference room surrounded by data screens, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but bright with excitement. For the past 6 hours, he and his team had been analyzing the footage from Engineering Bay 12, and what they were discovering was revolutionizing everything humanity thought it knew about dragon behavior. Commander Helen Price sat across from him, along with Ambassador Lisa Chen, Lieutenant Karen White, and several other senior staff members. They had left Danny and the hatchlings sleeping under careful observation, deciding that understanding what had happened was crucial before they proceeded. Hayes pulled up the first set of analysis data on the main screen. The hatchlings' vital signs from the prepared habitat showed stress markers that the team had missed at the time. The dragons had appeared calm, but their heart rates had been elevated, their metabolic processes slightly irregular. They had been tolerating the environment, not thriving in it. The readings from Engineering Bay 12 told a completely different story. Within days of arriving there, the hatchlings' stress markers had dropped to nearly zero. Their vital signs had normalized and even improved. They were healthier living in a cluttered workshop than they had been in the carefully designed habitat. But the real breakthrough came from Dr. Kelly Torres, a biologist who specialized in animal behavior. She had spent hours reviewing footage of the hatchlings watching Danny work, and she noticed patterns that others had missed. The hatchlings were not just hiding in his workshop, they were learning from him. Torres explained her findings to the group. Dragon hatchlings, she theorized, did not bond with environments or objects. They bonded with rhythms and patterns of life. In the wild, hatchling dragons would sleep on their parents' chests, learning the rhythm of their heartbeat, the pattern of their breathing, the vibrations of their movements. This was how young dragons learned to navigate the world, by synchronizing with the life patterns of their guardians. The prepared habitat had been perfect by human standards, but it was static and dead. There were no heartbeats to learn from, no living rhythms to synchronize with. The hatchlings had felt isolated there, cut off from the fundamental connection they needed to develop properly. Engineering Bay 12, despite being cluttered and noisy and imperfect, was alive. The constant hum of machinery created vibration patterns. The temperature fluctuated naturally based on equipment usage. Most importantly, Danny was there, a non-dime living presence with a heartbeat and breathing pattern and a rhythm of life that the hatchlings could observe and learn from. Hayes added another layer to the analysis. The footage showed that the hatchlings had watched Danny for days before approaching him. They were not just looking for any living being. They were evaluating him, studying his behavior, determining if he was worthy of their trust. What they saw in Danny was remarkable in its simplicity. He was consistent. He arrived at the same time, worked in the same methodical way, and approached problems with the same calm patience. He never pretended or performed. When he was frustrated, he showed it honestly. When he was tired, he did not hide it. He talked to himself and to his tools with the same casual tone he would use with another person. Most crucially, Danny never tried to be something he was not. He lived his life authentically, without any awareness that he was being observed or evaluated. This authenticity was apparently what the hatchlings had been searching for. Ambassador Chen leaned forward, her mind racing with the diplomatic implications. She asked the question that everyone was thinking. Why Danny specifically? What made him different from the hundreds of other crew members on the station? Dr. Hayes pulled up comparison data. Over the past 3 weeks, dozens of crew members had passed through areas where the hatchlings were hiding. The footage showed the hatchlings observing many of them, but they had only settled on Danny. The team had analyzed what made him different. The answer was both simple and profound. Most crew members who passed through the lower decks were either rushing to complete a task or were nervous about being in unfamiliar areas. They were tense, distracted, or performing their duties with their minds elsewhere. Danny, by contrast, was completely present in his work. When he repaired something, his entire focus was on that repair. When he talked to himself, he was genuinely working through problems, not performing for an imaginary audience. Additionally, Danny had grown up in an environment where he learned to be self-sufficient and comfortable in his own company. He did not need constant social interaction or validation. He was content in his solitude, which paradoxically made him more approachable. There was no neediness in him, no desperate desire for connection that might have felt threatening to young creatures trying to make such an important choice. Lieutenant White raised another interesting point. Danny's background in the Detroit reclamation zones had taught him to see value in broken things. His entire life was built around the idea that what was broken could be fixed, that what seemed useless could be restored to function. Perhaps the hatchlings sensed this quality in him, this fundamental belief in the possibility of repair and restoration. The team reviewed the moment when the hatchlings finally approached Danny as he slept. The footage showed them moving carefully, testing his reactions even in sleep. They were gentle and deliberate, making sure their presence would not disturb him. When he did not wake, when his body unconsciously accepted their warmth, they knew they had made the right choice. Dr. Hayes pulled up another set of data that made everyone in the room fall silent. He had contacted dragon cultural experts through back channels, people who had studied dragon society from a distance for decades. They confirmed what the evidence suggested. This was not an accident or a mistake. It was an ancient test. For thousands of years, the dragons had been sending their young to other species, allowing the hatchlings to choose their own guardians based on instinct. It was how dragons evaluated other species, not through formal negotiations or diplomatic protocols, but by seeing who their children trusted. Only a handful of species in the galaxy's long history had passed this test. The hatchlings were guided by instincts refined over millions of years of evolution. They could sense authenticity, consistency, and genuine character in ways that conscious analysis could never achieve. Their choice of Danny was not random or arbitrary. It was a profound statement about human nature, about the qualities that truly mattered when building trust across species. Ambassador Chen felt a weight lift from her shoulders even as a new one settled there. The diplomatic crisis was over. The hatchlings had not been lost or endangered. But now came the much more complex question of what this meant for humanity's relationship with the dragons, and specifically what it meant for Danny Ward. Commander Price was already thinking ahead to the practical implications. Danny would need to be informed carefully and gently. He would need support, and probably training. His life was about to change in ways that no mechanic could have anticipated. They would need to protect him from being overwhelmed while also allowing the bond with the hatchlings to develop naturally. Dr. Hayes made one final observation that resonated with everyone in the room. Danny had created a space that felt real. Not perfect, not designed to impress, but genuine and lived in. He had unknowingly offered the hatchlings something that all the planning and preparation in the world could not provide. He had offered them a home where they could simply exist, watch, and learn without pressure or expectations. And in doing so, he had accomplished what humanity's best diplomatic minds could not. As the meeting concluded and the team prepared to carefully wake Danny and begin the next phase of this extraordinary situation, they all understood that they had witnessed something remarkable. A tired mechanic sleeping on a couch with 3 dragon hatchlings curled on his chest would become one of the most important images in human history. It represented not humanity's technological achievement or diplomatic skill, but something far more valuable: the simple power of being genuine. Danny woke slowly, his body fighting to stay in the deep sleep it so desperately needed. The first thing he noticed was warmth on his chest, more warmth than usual. The second thing he noticed was that the warmth was moving, rising and falling with a rhythm that was not quite his own breathing. The third thing he noticed as his eyes finally opened was that he was not alone. 3 pairs of eyes stared at him from very close range. Large eyes, intelligent and curious, set in faces covered with shimmering scales. For a moment, Danny's brain refused to process what he was seeing. Then, like a switch flipping, everything clicked into place. Dragon hatchlings. On his chest. Staring at him, he went very, very still. His heart rate spiked, but he forced himself not to move suddenly. The hatchlings did not seem frightened by his waking. If anything, they seemed pleased. The smallest one making a soft chirping sound that reminded Danny of contentment. That was when he noticed the other people in his workshop. Commander Price stood a few meters away, along with people he recognized as Dr. Hayes, Ambassador Chen, and several security officers. They were all watching him with expressions that ranged from fascination to barely contained excitement. Danny's voice came out as a croak. He asked what was happening, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The missing dragon hatchlings that the entire station had been searching for were sleeping on his chest. That seemed to answer the question of where they had been. Commander Price stepped forward carefully, her voice calm and measured. She explained that they had found the hatchlings about 7 hours ago, that Danny and the dragons had been sleeping together peacefully, and that the team had been observing and analyzing the situation while waiting for him to wake naturally. She also explained in simple terms that this was not an accident. The hatchlings had chosen him. Danny looked down at the 3 small dragons still resting on and around him. The smallest one had its head directly over his heart. He could feel its warmth through his dirty uniform. He asked the question that seemed most obvious to him. Why would they choose him? He was just a mechanic. He barely even knew the hatchlings existed until a few seconds ago. Dr. Hayes moved closer, tablet in hand, and began explaining what his team had discovered. He talked about bonding patterns and authenticity, and how the hatchlings had been watching Danny for weeks. He explained the dragon test, the ancient practice of allowing hatchlings to choose their own guardians based on character rather than status. Danny listened, his mind struggling to process information that seemed too large to fit into his understanding of his own life. He looked at the hatchlings again, really looked at them. They were beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. Their scales caught the light and reflected it in colors he did not have names for. They were small enough to hold, but their eyes held an intelligence that was almost overwhelming to meet directly. Ambassador Chen spoke next, her voice gentle but serious. She explained what this meant for humanity, how the dragon species had tested other races this way throughout history, how few had ever passed. The hatchlings choosing a human meant that humanity had been accepted by one of the oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy. It meant opportunities for partnership, for knowledge exchange, for a relationship that could change humanity's place in the cosmos. And it all depended on Danny. On whether he was willing to accept the role the hatchlings had chosen him. For Danny felt panic rising in his chest. He was not a diplomat or a scientist or anyone important. He fixed machines. He lived alone in a cluttered workshop and drank terrible coffee and talked to himself. How could he possibly be responsible for something this significant? The smallest hatchling, feeling his heart rate increase, made another soft sound and pressed closer against him. The touch was comforting in a way Danny had not expected. He took a breath and forced himself to think clearly. These creatures had watched him for weeks. They had seen him at his most tired, most frustrated, most genuine. If they had chosen him, maybe they knew something he did not. He asked what would happen if he said no. Commander Price answered honestly. They would respect his choice, but they would need to find another solution. And there was no guarantee the hatchlings would accept anyone else. This moment, this bond that had formed, might be unique. Walking away from it could mean losing the opportunity entirely. Danny looked at the hatchlings again. They were still watching him, patient and calm. He realized with some surprise that he did not want to say no. Despite the fear and the overwhelming nature of what was being asked of him, he felt connected to these creatures. They had chosen his space, his presence, his rhythm of life. They had found something in him worth trusting. How could he reject that? He said yes. The word came out quiet but firm. He would do whatever was needed. He would learn, adapt, and figure out how to be what the hatchlings needed him to be. He was a mechanic. Fixing complicated problems was what he did best. Commander Price smiled, relief evident on her face. She explained that the dragon representatives were waiting to speak with him, that the hatchlings' parents wanted to meet the human their children had chosen. It would happen soon, within hours. Danny felt his stomach drop, but he nodded. If he was going to do this, he might as well start now. Dr. Hayes approached and carefully used a scanner on the hatchlings, checking their vital signs now that everyone was awake. The data made him smile. The hatchlings were in perfect health, thriving in a way they had not in the prepared habitat. He looked at Danny with something like awe, and told him that he had done something remarkable, even if he did not fully understand what it was yet. The team began preparing Danny for what would come next. They needed to move him and the hatchlings to a more formal setting for the meeting with the adult dragons. But they had to do it carefully, keeping the hatchlings calm and maintaining the bond that had formed. Lieutenant White brought fresh clothes for Danny, since his current uniform was covered in grease and coolant. The hatchlings watched with interest as he carefully stood up, their eyes tracking his movements. When he moved toward the small bathroom in his workshop to clean up, all 3 hatchlings followed him, not willing to let him out of their sight. Danny found himself talking to them as he washed his face and changed clothes. He told them he had no idea what he was doing, that this was the strangest morning of his life, and that he hoped they knew what they were getting into by choosing him. The hatchlings responded with soft chirps and stayed close, their presence somehow reassuring despite everything. When he emerged from the bathroom in clean clothes, Danny took a moment to look at himself in the reflection of a polished metal panel. He looked the same as always, maybe more tired than usual, but still just Danny Ward, mechanic. Except now 3 dragon hatchlings were sitting at his feet, looking up at him with trust and expectation. His life had changed completely in the space between falling asleep and waking up. Commander Price approached and asked if he was ready. Danny looked down at the hatchlings, took a breath, and nodded. He had no idea what meeting the adult dragons would be like, or what would be expected of him, or how his life would change going forward. But the hatchlings had chosen him, and that meant something. He would not let them down. As they prepared to leave Engineering Bay 12, Danny took one last look at his workshop. It looked the same as always, cluttered and lived in and real, but it would never mean the same thing again. This space, with its tools and machines and worn couch, had become the birthplace of a relationship that would echo across the galaxy. And Danny, a simple mechanic who just wanted to fix things, was at the center of it all. The main hangar of Station Liberty had been transformed for the meeting. Every non-essential crew member had been evacuated, leaving only key personnel and security. The space felt enormous and empty, which was necessary given what was about to arrive. Danny stood in the center of the hangar, the 3 hatchlings arranged around his feet, and tried not to think about how terrified he was. Commander Price stood nearby, along with Ambassador Chen and Dr. Hayes. They had coached Danny on basic protocol, but everyone understood that this meeting would be unlike anything humanity had experienced before. The dragons operated on their own terms by their own rules. All Danny could do was be himself and hope that was enough. The dragon ship appeared without warning, the same way it had 3 weeks ago. It materialized in space near the station, a vessel so large that it blocked out the stars behind it. A shuttle detached and approached the hangar at a speed that seemed impossibly slow and incredibly fast at the same time. When it docked, the entire station seemed to hold its breath. The airlock cycled open. What emerged was beyond anything Danny had imagined. 3 adult dragons entered the hangar, and their presence was overwhelming. They were massive, easily the size of small spacecraft, with scales that seemed to contain entire galaxies. Their eyes were ancient beyond measure, holding wisdom and power that made Danny feel like an insect in comparison. The hatchlings at Danny's feet began chirping excitedly, their voices high and clear. They moved forward slightly but did not leave his side, as if presenting him to their parents. The adult dragons approached slowly, their movements graceful despite their size. Danny forced himself to stand still, to not run, to meet this moment with whatever courage he could find. The largest dragon lowered her head to Danny's level. She was so close he could feel the heat radiating from her scales, could see his own reflection in eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe. She spoke, and her voice came through a translation device that rendered her words in clear, precise English. She introduced herself as the matriarch of her flight, the mother of 2 of the hatchlings and guardian of the 3rd. She thanked Danny for caring for her children, though she said the word caring, with an inflection that suggested it meant something more than its simple translation implied. Then she explained what Danny had already been told, but needed to hear directly from her. This had been a test, not a test of humanity's technology or military might or diplomatic skill, but a test of character. For thousands of years, her people had sent their young to other species, allowing the hatchlings to choose guardians based on instinct and observation. The hatchlings were never wrong. They could sense authenticity, presence, and genuine character in ways that could not be faked or performed. In the entire recorded history of her people, only 7 other species had been chosen by hatchlings. Humanity was the 8th, and Danny, a mechanic who lived quietly in a cluttered workshop, was the reason why. The matriarch asked Danny a question that made his heart pound. She asked if he understood why her children had chosen him. Not the scientific explanations or the analysis of behavior patterns, but truly understood at a deeper level. Danny thought about it carefully. He thought about his workshop, his routine, his simple life. He thought about the hatchlings watching him work, listening to him talk to himself, observing him in his most unguarded moments. And he realized that maybe he did understand at least a little bit. He told the matriarch that he thought the hatchlings had chosen him because he never pretended to be anything other than what he was. He did not try to impress them or perform for them because he had not known they were there. He just lived his life, fixed his machines, and existed in his space without artifice or pretense. Maybe that was what they needed. Maybe that was what they had been looking for. The matriarch made a sound that the translator rendered as approval. She said that Danny understood more than most beings twice his age. She explained that her people valued authenticity above all else, that they had learned over millions of years that true character revealed itself only when beings believed themselves unobserved. Danny had been observed for weeks without knowing it, and he had shown himself to be worthy of trust. Then the matriarch said something that changed everything. She said that humanity had passed the test, and with that passing came an invitation. The dragons wished to form a partnership with humans, to share knowledge and resources, to build a relationship that could benefit both species. But such a relationship required a bridge, someone who could move between both worlds and help each understand the other. The hatchlings had chosen their bridge. They had chosen Danny. The weight of those words settled on Danny's shoulders like a physical thing. He was being asked to become a liaison between humanity and one of the most powerful species in the galaxy. He was being offered a role that would define the rest of his life and possibly the future of his entire species. He looked down at the 3 hatchlings. They were watching him with those intelligent eyes, waiting to see what he would say. He thought about saying no, about explaining that he was not qualified for something this important. But then he thought about how the hatchlings had trusted him, how they had chosen him out of hundreds of possibilities. If they believed in him, maybe he should believe in himself. Danny accepted. He said yes to the role, yes to the responsibility, yes to the future that had just opened up before him. He told the matriarch that he would do his best, that he would learn whatever he needed to learn, and that he would honor the trust her children had placed in him. The matriarch made that approval sound again. She said that the hatchlings would remain with him, would grow under his care and guidance. As they grew, they would teach him about their people, and he would teach them about humans. The relationship would develop naturally, built on the foundation of trust that had already been established. Commander Price stepped forward and formally welcomed the dragons to an ongoing partnership with humanity. Agreements would need to be drawn up, protocols established, and frameworks created, but the foundation was solid. The hatchlings had chosen, and that choice had opened doors that humanity had not even known existed. As the formal meeting concluded, and the adult dragons prepared to return to their ship, the smallest hatchling, the one Danny had started thinking of as Sparks, climbed up his leg and settled on his shoulder. The weight was comforting, a reminder that this was real, that this was happening. In the days and weeks that followed, Danny's life transformed in ways both dramatic and subtle. He became the official human liaison to the Draconis Collective, a title that came with responsibilities and opportunities he was still learning to navigate. But he insisted on keeping his position as chief mechanic, working in Engineering Bay 12 whenever his schedule allowed. The hatchlings stayed with him, splitting their time between formal diplomatic functions and the workshop where they felt most at home. The bay became a gathering place for scientists and diplomats who wanted to observe the human-dragon bond in action. But Danny kept it as functional and lived in as ever, refusing to turn his workspace into a museum. This was still his home, and the hatchlings deserved a real home, not a showcase. As weeks turned into months, the hatchlings grew rapidly. Sparks, Bolt, and Flicker, as Danny had named them with the matriarch's amused approval, became fixtures on the station. They attended diplomatic meetings, participated in cultural exchanges, and served as living bridges between two very different species. But they always returned to Engineering Bay 12, to the couch where they had first slept on Danny's chest, to the space that had become their anchor. Other species in the galaxy began to take humanity more seriously. The dragon endorsement carried weight that no amount of military power or technological advancement could match. New partnerships formed, trade agreements were signed, and humanity's position in the galactic community shifted dramatically. But perhaps the most important change was in how humans approached diplomacy itself. What became known as the Ward Protocol spread through human diplomatic corps, a new approach that emphasized authenticity over performance, genuine connection over calculated strategy. The idea was simple but profound. The best way to build relationships was to be genuinely yourself and allow others to do the same. Danny trained other humans in this approach, though he always insisted he was not doing anything special. He was just being himself, he would say, but that was exactly the point. Being yourself, genuinely and without pretense, was the most powerful diplomatic tool humanity possessed. Years later, when the hatchlings had grown into magnificent adult dragons, and Danny had become one of the most respected figures in human-dragon relations, people would ask him about that first morning. They would ask what it felt like to wake up and find he had been chosen, to discover his life had changed completely overnight. Danny always answered the same way. He said it felt like coming home. The hatchlings had not changed who he was. They had simply recognized who he was and valued it. They had seen a tired mechanic living authentically in a cluttered workshop and decided that was exactly what they needed in a galaxy full of species trying to prove their worth through grand gestures and impressive displays. Humanity had succeeded by offering